Hi. I'm going to actually use the three words that I know in Arabic here. Salam. That was a really great speech. And I have to say, if you learn nothing else from this conference but what you've just heard from Mr. Fadi, you will go away a very wise business person. And in fact, I wrote a whole book that really, I should say, it just reinforces what Mr. Fadi just said. So I really think you should take everything that he said to heart. Now, it's very, very exciting to be here. You are a generation that has a tremendous opportunity and a tremendous responsibility. When the revolution was happening, I and everybody I know were glued to our television sets in the United States to see what was going on. And I think that Mr. Fadi actually laid out to you sort of what the challenge is for you. There's a confusion, and it's not just in Egypt, it's in the United States as well, between two types of capitalism. There's one type that is crony capitalism, which is corrupt, and in which basically people get ahead by doing deals with people in power. And then there's entrepreneurial capitalism, which is a whole different ballgame. And that's where people get ahead on merit and on the quality of their ideas. And I think that that is something that is going to play itself out. It's playing itself out in the United States. I think it's going to play itself out here as well. And you're in the forefront of it. So I have to say it's very exciting to be here. Now, if I can figure out how this works. Let me just say that I have a regular speech that I give, but I only have 10 minutes. So I had to throw that one away, and instead I'm going to just give you 4 points, because I know you've all got better things to do, to go out and, come up with the idea for the next Google or what have you. Let me tell you a little bit about who I am. I should probably tell you first about what Inc. magazine is. Inc. magazine is a magazine for entrepreneurs in the United States. It was started in 1979. I went to work for it in 1983 when it was still basically a startup. That time, the early 1980s, in the United States reminds me very much of what I see right now in Egypt. There was a time in the United States when it was not a compliment to call somebody an entrepreneur. It was sort of a put down. But that was beginning to change. And from 1980 until today, there's been really an entrepreneurial revolution and the whole development of an entrepreneurial economy. And Inc., I've been very lucky to be able to watch it. You got the old guys here today. I've also been at Inc. for about 30 years. You can see, well, anybody know who that is? Anybody recognize that guy? What? There you go, it's Steve Jobs. But that was Steve Jobs in 1981, when Apple was still a pretty small company, and we wrote about him back then. In fact, there was an article about Apple in the first issue of Inc. magazine, and it was about this little company in Cupertino, California, which was making computers and had decided to name itself after a fruit. Since then, we've grown a lot. I think probably we are best known for what is called the Inc. 500 right now. The Inc. 500 is a listing of the 500 fastest growing privately held companies in the United States, and we'd put it out every year. This is the list where great companies appear before anybody knows who they are. Microsoft, the second year that I was at Inc. in 1984, there was a little company in Washington called Microsoft, which was on the list. That same year, there was another little company called Oracle on the list. They all appear here before, unless they grow too fast. There are few that grow too fast to appear on the list, but they're few and far between. And since then, you know, more recently, we've really been covering what's been happening in the new economy. I don't know how many of you are familiar with any of these companies. Tony Hsieh is the founder of Zappos. He's a really remarkable guy who's got has developed a terrific company. He's got a book out, which I would highly recommend. This company called Threadless is actually a T-shirt company. The founders were invited to speak at MIT because they have, you know, basically created a new way of building a company. Over there is Paul Graham of Y Combinator, you know, who I guess Clint was referring to yesterday. Somebody was referring to him yesterday. So we sort of write about these people. We take pride in writing about these people before anybody else has heard about them. And as I say, I started working there, you know, in the early 1980s, in 1983. And it was a very lucky time for me. I was probably a little bit older than at the time, maybe the same age as some of you. And so were people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and so forth. And I just happened to wind up in a spot where I was able to get to know a lot of these companies and the people involved in them when they were all still pretty young. And I'm talking, you know, about certainly Jobs and Apple. I don't know if you recognize these guys. That is actually the Microsoft Corporation. And you may recognize him. Here's another picture of him from about the same time. But I got to know a lot of these companies. Some of them you may be familiar with. I don't know, Yvon Chouinard and Patagonia, Nita Roddick and The Body Shop, Tom Stenberg and Staples, and so forth and so on. And one thing that I noticed about the best of these companies back then was that they had something very special going for them. It was something that you could sense as soon as you spent any time around them. It was a kind of a magnetism, a power of attraction. And I didn't have a name for it back then, but I do now. It's what I call mojo. And by that I mean the business equivalent of charisma. When a leader has charisma, you want to follow him or her. When a business has mojo, you want to be associated with that business. You want to buy from it. You want to sell to it. You want to work for it. You want to wear its T-shirts and its caps. You know, if its leaders are speaking someplace, you want to go hear them speak. If there are articles or books written about them, you want to read those articles and books. It's what you feel when you're in the presence of greatness in business. I have actually been very fortunate to spend most of my adult life around companies that have this quality. And I actually wrote a book about 14 of them. The book is called Small Giants. And the subtitle, as you can see, is Companies That Choose to Be Great Instead of Big. And this harkens back to the point that Mr. Fadi was making, that the central question of the book is, what is it? Now, I don't know in Arabic if great and big are the same word. They aren't the same. They're different words. Okay, good. Because basically the idea, you know, I said I was going to give you 4 points. Here's the first one to take home, and it really reiterates the point that Mr. Fadi was making, which is bigger is not better. You know, being big and great are two different things. A small company can be great, and a big company can be a blot on humanity. So when you are thinking about building your company, I'm sure what you want is to build a great company. It may be a big company. There are big companies that are great, but don't make the common mistake of confusing what is great with what is big. Now, my book, Small Giants, as I say, the idea in it is, okay, where do companies, it's about companies that have this mojo, and I think that they have the mojo, they are great companies, and the question I write about in there is, where does the mojo come from? I can talk about that afterwards. I'm going to be around for a while. That's usually what I give my whole speech to, but I only have 10 minutes. So if you want to talk to me about it later, I'll be happy to share that with you. The second point, really, that I would like you to, yes, okay. This is a thought that occurred to me yesterday. Actually, it was when Clint Nelson was talking about Startup Weekend, and I was fascinated by it, and he mentioned that there was one company that came out of Startup Weekend with $2 million in venture capital money. My immediate response is, I'm afraid for that company. It is very, very hard for a startup company to spend $2 million in the right way. You got $2 million in the bank, which you really don't need. What are you going to do? You wind up spending it on big boardroom tables or building big places. And I will say this, in that in the time I've been at Inc., I can tell you that more promising startups have been killed by having too much money than by having too little money. That's probably something that's hard to appreciate at a point when you're just dying to get any money at all. But some of you may find yourself in that situation. The point is that when you have too little money, it may feel like it's a big problem to you, but actually it's a blessing. And the reason it's a blessing is because in order to be successful, you've got to use your head. It's very easy to solve problems with money. The problem is when you solve problems with money, you don't learn anything and you don't innovate. It's when you use your head to solve problems, when you come up with ways around obstacles, when you run into a stone wall and you figure out that you can't just buy your way out of the situation. You've got to innovate your way out of the situation. That's where the magic of startups come in. And so I would urge you all, particularly in the tech sphere, where there's so much emphasis. You talk to anybody and they'll say, oh, this company is great. It raised, a first round of $10 million. It had a valuation of $200 million. Well, there were a lot of those back in the late 1990s, and they aren't around today. So that's a point I would urge you all to keep in mind here. Let me see, what else? Number 2. Again, I'm just really repeating what Mr. Fadi said. I will say this, the number one success factor in business is resilience. And by that I mean the ability to bounce back from your mistakes and to learn the lessons and move on. I guarantee that every one of you here is going to make, I don't care how smart you are, you're going to make thousands of mistakes. Some of them may be fatal to your company. Some of them may be near fatal to your company. Your long-term success is going to have to do with your ability to learn from those mistakes, get yourself up, brush yourself off, and go forward. This is a lesson I learned from my friend Norm Brodsky, with whom I've written a couple of books, and I write a column in Inc. magazine. Norm is right now in the record storage business. I don't know if you know what they do in record storage. They basically put boxes on shelves and take boxes off shelves. That's not real sexy, okay? You probably do not sit around dreaming about having a company that puts boxes on shelves. But I'll tell you, Norm has done very well with it. Actually, when he started out, he was a little older than some of you. It was in 1979. He started his first company, and it was a delivery company. And he had this. He's a very smart guy, and he's an extremely good salesperson, and he went out, and his goal was to grow this company to $100 million. He wanted to have $100 million. That's all he cared about. If you asked him why he wanted to have a $100 million company, he couldn't have told you. He said it just seemed like a good number. Back then it does. Now you want to have a $1 billion company. But then $100 million seemed like a lot of money. And lo and behold, over the course of the next 8 years, he built that company. His company, Perfect Courier, went from 0 to $120 million in 8 years. It then went from $120 million almost all the way back to 0 in 8 months. It wasn't funny. In fact, it was a searing experience for him. It was also the most important experience of his entire business career. I mean, it was very hard, and it was particularly hard on all his employees because he wound up having to lay off thousands of people who had done nothing wrong. He was the one who had made the decisions, the bad decisions, that had put the company into Chapter 11, which is our form of reorganization under protection of the court. But he was able to come out of that, and it took him a while, it took him a couple of years. And he began to think, what did I do wrong? How did I ever get us in this situation? And he learned a lot of lessons. Now, a number of those lessons are in the book that I wrote with him. It came out in hardback, and it was called The Knack: How Street Smart Entrepreneurs Learn to Handle Whatever Comes Up. For some reason, the publisher decided when they brought out the paperback to call it Street Smarts, an all-purpose toolkit for entrepreneurs. Why? I don't know, but it was their choice. Those are the same book. If you have a chance to buy one, don't buy both of them. They're the exact same book. But we tell a lot of the stories, a lot of Norm's stories, and about the lessons that he learned in the course of this. And he was able, after this, to learn those lessons, to pick himself up, and to start his new business, the record storage business. 2 years ago, he sold that company for $120 million. And it was because of the lessons that he learned. Now, one of those lessons had to do with point number 3, namely that he needed to understand the numbers of his business. When he was starting up his business, he and his investors were only interested in one thing. Anybody guess what the investors all wanted to know? What? They wanted, actually, it would have been good if they wanted profit. They all wanted sales. That's all they were interested in. They all asked him. He got up every morning and he went and he said, what were sales? And he just wanted sales. And his investors, they were accountants. And all they said was, what are your sales? What are your sales? What are your sales? One of the lessons that he learned from this failure was that sales are nice, profits are nicer, but you live or die on cash flow. You run out of cash, you're out of business. It's as simple as that. You can't pay your bills, you're out of business. There were all those companies in the late 90s in the United States, and I guess around the world, and that thought that they could go on forever because they'd invented a fantastic new way of running a business, and they weren't dependent on profits. That they could just go on forever. I mean, I had a friend who was going to take a company public back then, and he had a very profitable company, and his underwriter told him, you got to get rid of this profit. People will hold it against you. You won't be attractive to investors. Well, they all got their abrupt lesson in March of 2001 that the cash does run out. Now, I will say that along with this, the thing for you to remember is that every startup has the same goal. Every single startup has the same goal. And that is to reach viability. First on paper, in other words, first you need to be able to look at what you're going to be doing on paper, and then you need to prove it in reality. What is viability? The definition of viability is this: a company is able to sustain itself on its own internally generated cash flow. You're not dependent on angel investors. You're not dependent on venture capitalists. You're not dependent on the bank. You're not dependent on your own savings. You aren't dependent on the money that you've borrowed from your friends and your family. You've gotten the company to the point where you don't need their money to survive. That's the first goal. A lot of companies never reach that point. Those are the ones that go out of business. But if you do reach that point, then the world opens up to you, because suddenly you have choices. Before you reach viability, the only thing you're focusing on is, how do I get there? After you reach viability, you've got choices about what you want to do. Now, a lot of what we talk about in Street Smarts and in the NAC, depending on which copy of the book you decide to read, is exactly this question of viability and how to get there. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of building a company, which is tremendous. I mean, there's nothing more exciting than building a company and having it succeed. But to ignore the numbers, or to really not make the effort to educate yourself about the numbers, it's a fatal mistake. Sooner or later, it's going to catch up with you. And the numbers are not, I'm not talking about that you're saying that you necessarily have to go to school and become an accountant. Most business people I know, most entrepreneurs that I know are not accountants, they're salespeople. By and large, companies tend to be started by people. Well, high-tech companies are a lot started by engineers, but even the engineers have to be salespeople. Why? Because when you're starting a company, you have to sell your company to everybody. You have to sell it to your investors, not just to your customers. You have to sell it to your investors. You have to sell it to your employees. You have to sell it to everybody. You're selling your vision to all of those people. And there's a common wisdom that sometimes develops that good sales solve all problems. If you ever hear anybody tell you that, run the other way, because good sales don't solve all problems. And I know lots of companies that have had very good sales and have grown very fast, and then they hit a wall and they folded. They failed. Happens all the time, unfortunately. And finally, the fourth point that I want to leave you with is, again, something that Mr. Fadi also talked about. I guess I'd put a little bit of a spin on it. When I talk about the quality of the team, I will say this, that the smarter your people are, the more successful your company would be. A lot of times when you talk about team, you think about, well, the developers, the executives, and so forth. The smartest teams include everybody in the company. One of the best, most capable entrepreneurs I know is that guy in the middle. I also wrote a couple books with him. His name is Jack Stack. He has a company that is now called SRC Holdings. Back when I first knew it, it was called Springfield Remanufacturing Corporation. It was part of a company that was a very big company before most of you were born, namely International Harvester. In 1979, it was the 11th largest company in the world. By 1982, it was on the brink of bankruptcy. There's a long story about how it got there. The point was that it was selling off assets right and left, or closing down factories and that sort of thing. We were in the middle of a terrible recession in the United States, a recession with high unemployment and also extremely high interest rates. And it was very, very hard to get a job. And the people who worked in that factory were scared that if it would close down, they would be unemployed. They wouldn't be able to support their families. And so they put in a bid for the factory. And they bid $7 million. Much to their surprise, International Harvester accepted their bid. Now, these were not rich people. These were ordinary working stiffs. Some of them had college education, some of them didn't. But they knew that if they were going to survive, they had to somehow get this money. They were able to scrounge up about $100,000 among themselves. And then they went out and borrowed $8.9 million from the Bank of America. The guy who made this loan was fired a week before they closed the deal. It was the worst leverage buyout in history. This is a company that started out with an 89-to-1 debt-to-equity ratio. Most banks think you're in trouble if your debt-equity ratio is above 2-to-1. So when you have an 89-to-1 debt-equity ratio, you're brain dead. You're on life support. And they had to figure out how they were going to survive. And they said, well, somehow we got to let everybody... There are two things that we can't do. Number one, we can't run out of cash. If we run out of cash, the bank will come in here, it'll seize the assets, it'll sell them off. They didn't want to do this loan anyway, and we'll all be out on the street. The other thing they said we can't do is we can't destroy ourselves from within. We can't start fighting over things, because then we'll take our eye off the ball, and the cash will run out, and we'll all be out on the streets. So they said, how do we make sure that everybody is on the same team here? Now, understand, this company remanufactured engines. So when I say everybody, I'm talking about 120 people, most of whom did not have a high school education, who worked on the factory floor, and they took apart dirty old engines from tractors and construction equipment, used worn-out engines. They replaced parts in them, they put them back together, and they sold them. It was a big recycling operation for engines for construction equipment and heavy-duty, other heavy-duty vehicles. But they said, look, we got to let everybody know what's going on here. How do we do that? And they said, well, the only way I know to do that is to look at what the financial statements say. So they went out and they said, okay, we're going to teach everybody here how to read financial statements. First place, we want you to forget everything you've heard about business. It's not complicated. You don't need an MBA to understand it. Business is a game. And like every game, in order to play it, you have to get it. And in order to get it, three things have to exist. Number one, you have to know what the rules are. Number two, you have to get enough information that you can follow the action and keep score. And number three, you need to have a stake in the outcome. You need to care about whether or not you win or lose. It's as true in football as it is in business. And they set up their whole company around that. And they wound up educating this entire workforce on, they created what they called a business of business people. And they went from being a $16 million company in 1983 with 120 employees to today a $500 million company with over 1,000 employees. Not only that, those employees, some of whom started out as secretaries or janitors or people who turned wrenches on the floor, learned about business and were able to go off and start their own companies. Those are some of the companies that were started by the people who worked in that factory and who learned about business by working in that factory. That company is one of the best, solidest companies I've ever run into. And in fact, there's going to be a conference next week because I wrote a book with Jack Stack called The Great Game of Business. And I've got a copy here someplace, which I can show to you. But it's since been, their way of running a business has since been adopted by all kinds of other people. So those are the four things that I wanted to tell you. Okay? Bigger's not better. Beware of VCs offering you millions of dollars. You win or lose by the numbers. What was the other one? What? Bigger is not better, of course. What? Oh, yeah. Well, the team. Yes, the team. Well, since, you know, I did just put this together, so why don't we just go back and review them? Ah, yes, success. Number one, bigger is not better. Number two, don't be seduced by VCs. Well, that's not number two. Number two is the number one success factor is the ability to bounce back from your mistakes, learn from your mistakes, and move on. Number three, that success is in the numbers. Educate yourself about the numbers. And number four, it's all about the quality of the team. So I want to wind up, I guess, actually, by telling you something about a lesson that I learned from the founder of Inc. magazine, who was a great guy named Bernard Goldhirsch. And when I went to work for Inc. in 1983, I didn't know anything really about entrepreneurship or business. And he had to sort of, and that was true of all the people who worked in the magazine, and he had to tell us. He himself had started two magazines. The first one was the first magazine in the United States for people who loved sailing, and it was called Sail Magazine. And he had started that business after he'd gotten out of, he was an engineer, but he got out of MIT and he decided he wanted to be a sailor, so he went down to the Caribbean and started sailing around. And eventually he had to earn a living, so he started a newsletter called Sail, and Sail newsletter became Sail the magazine, and suddenly it was worth $1 million, and he suddenly found himself in business. And he never intended to be in business. He wasn't even sure he liked business. But he had all kinds of problems. How do you hire people? How do you fire people? How do you raise money? You know, how do you market? And so forth and so on. And he looked around at the magazines. There wasn't anything there. And so he said, I'm going to start another magazine. And the magazine for people like me, and the magazine he started was Inc. magazine. And he had an experience when he was in college, when he went to work in the laboratory of Dr. Edwin Land, who was the inventor of the Polaroid camera. And he came out of it with this great appreciation for what it is that entrepreneurs do. And he said, you know, entrepreneurship is essentially a creative endeavor. You know, you need to think of entrepreneurs, he would tell us, as artists using both sides of their brains. When you write for entrepreneurs, you need to think that you're writing for people who have the passion of an artist, but their means of success happens to be business. Their means of expression happens to be business. And I think that's true of all of you here. And I think it's ultimately what's going to make you successful as long as you're resilient and keep on going on after you make mistakes. So I'm going to wind up with that. Do we have time for questions or not?
Just one question.
Okay, we will have one question. I do have some books here, which I will be giving away. I guess I'll give them to the people who win the. Okay, work hard on your things, and because I'll be handing out some books later. Do we have a question? Anybody have a question here? I'll give you a book now if you ask a question.
I have a quick question, okay? I will tell you.
What? Okay, you guys have got lots to do. Oh, wait, there's a question in the back there. This better be a good one.
How's it going? I can't promise that'll be a good question, but I'll do my best. I really like Inc. magazine, and you guys recently published a really great article by Susie Sosa about social entrepreneurship in the Middle East. And I think that, and obviously Fadi is a huge beacon of hope and support for this. What steps do you think can be taken, given there's so much interest obviously here today and in this conference in pure entrepreneurship and this concept? How can we transfer that a little bit possibly into promoting and not just encouraging, but from grassroots efforts to make social entrepreneurship as sexy as regular entrepreneurship possible?
Well, you know, I'm really glad you asked that question because that's a subject that I address at some length in my book, Small Giants. One of the things that gives these, I have actually 6 criteria, 6 things that all these companies that are great companies do in common, and I basically think that their mojo comes from that. And one of the things is the relationships with the communities in which they do business. You have a small giant. I think Fadi probably has a small giant. They take very seriously what Fadi was telling you before about that business is not that businesses, companies are the building blocks not just of an economy but of a whole way of life. They determine the values that we live by, the communities that we live in, and the quality of the lives that we lead. When businesses hold themselves to a high standard, when they make sure that what they are doing is giving back to the communities in which they live and work, the whole society benefits. When they don't hold themselves to a high standard, as you well know, because there have been plenty of companies in Egypt that have not held themselves to a high standard, the entire society suffers. And there are no companies that hold themselves to a higher standard than the small giants, and it's a standard I think that every company can aspire to and many can achieve. And the more of you that do it, the better off Egypt will be, and so will the rest of the world. So that was a good question. You get a book. Okay, thank you, everybody. Good luck with your